Okay, it's an enormous pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague Henrike Lähnemann, who is a fellow of St Edmund Hall and an expert in all kinds of music, I would say, but especially the music of the Reformation. She actually grew up in Reformation Germany, as it were, and knows this music absolutely from the heart. And I think it's a huge pleasure to have her here, and I'll hand over to Henrike now.
Thank you, Geoffrey. I first encountered Oxford really under the guidance of Geoffrey, both musically. I was first living here in the parish and had the pleasure of sometimes playing in church with Geoffrey's accompaniment, but also architecturally following his traces. And what has fascinated me since coming to England is how the modern English hymnal and the modern German hymnal share quite a number of features, but how they this compendium has come about is by very different routes. So it starts together in the 16th century and it merges again in the 21st century, with, but in between there are ins and outs, which we want to follow today. And I'll do it with good Protestant pedagogy. So all my ancestors on the paternal side were Protestant ministers and always preach with 3 points. So I'll take you through 3 reasons why hymns from the Reformation period has really shaped not only German music and theology, but culture in a wider sense. And I'll illustrate it by 3 hymns which made their way into ancient and modern from different periods of German history, but I would argue all of them take their impulse originally from the Reformation hymn book of the 16th century. So the 3 hymns we are going to look at is one by Martin Luther, Ein feste Burg, his version of Psalm 46. Then we'll look at a Paul Gerhardt hymn, Jesu, meine Freude, which you might know in the setting of Bach motet, which I want to argue is actually a rewriting of Martin Luther's hymn. And then we'll close with a look at Bonhoeffer's poem von guten Mächten, which has become an iconic a hymn for the 20th century, written while he was imprisoned in 1944. And again, I would argue it's his meditating on the German Protestant hymn tradition, and particularly on Jesu, meine Freude, that makes him write this hymn. And the 3 aspects I want to show with that is hymns as communal singing, hymns as emotional theology, and hymns as form of protest. And that obviously links back to the Reformation as a protest movement. And I want to start you off with a quiz question. So, which tool did Luther use in 1517 to make an impact? Benji?
95 theses.
Yeah, what? Hammer. Any other questions? Actually, Benji has the point, because whether he used a hammer or not is very dubious. He couldn't, it was always Katharina who had to do all the practical stuff at home. So, yeah, and probably he wouldn't have hammered it anyway. But the tool he used was the printing press. And that made a much greater impact than 1,000 hammers he could have been using. So when we started to celebrate the quincentenary, or celebration is a difficult word, to commemorate the Reformation in 1517, we looked again at three aspects which contributed to the success of the Reformation in Germany. And the first one is printing. I just this morning took my historical linguistics students to the printing press in the Bodleian Library, and we typeset the end of the prologue of the September Testament. I'll hand both round. The September Testament is the New Testament printed in 1522 in September, so the quincentenary of this is now coming up. And this really, you could call that the real birth date for the Reformation, because their printing was joined by translation, making the material accessible. Then there is the third element, which entered in 1524, and that is singing. 1524 saw the publication of the first Protestant hymn book, and by 1530 you had about 200 different editions all across Germany. And you could see these three activities as expanding really the reach of the theological movement. Printing reached those who could afford to buy a printed book and could read Latin, the 95 Theses in Latin. With a translation, it reached also those who couldn't read Latin but German. And if you versify then the theology, then you can reach those who can't read but can sing along. And there are countless accounts of how the congregation would stand up in the middle of a sermon by a Catholic priest whom they didn't agree with and just start to sing Nun freut euch Lieben, lasst uns fröhlich bringen, dass wir getrost und all in ein mit Lust und Liebe singen. So it's one of Luther's best known hymn says we have to be joyful about the grace revealed to us, and therefore we have to sing. And that's what we're going to do today. So I'll get you to sing along to the three hymns that I've picked. And just as a kind of preview, I'll have you vote in the end. So the third hymn, the Bonhoeffer one, we'll sing in with five different tunes. And I would like you to vote for your favorite tune. But to go back to the rapidly evolving situation in Germany in the 1520s, Luther had always been particularly fascinated by the Psalms as the widest possible mode of engagement with emotions and so on. So that he gave his first lecture as a young lecturer at the University of Wittenberg on the Psalms, and had for his students very pedagogically a special book printed by the local printers, double-spaced, so they could write their notes in, and we have actually, he used it to prepare his lectures. This is one of the most fascinating documents for the development of his theology, because while reading the Psalter, he developed his ideas of salvation by grace alone. And we must imagine him not just silently reading the Psalter, but as a Augustinian friar, he would have sung them daily in the monastic office. So the very first hymn he wrote, even before the 95 Theses, was more or less for his own, to pull himself out of depression, out of the depth I cry to thee. Aus tiefer Not schrei ich zu dir, Herr Gott, erhör mein Rufen. So he was a good musician, could compose, so he really pictures through the music as well as through the words. So, aus tiefer, deep, out of the, I cry to the Rufen, so hear my calling. And he injects, he uses the old church modes for that. So it's the Phrygian mode, which is even darker than minor. So with 4 flats if you're instead of 3 flats if you start on a C. And so he uses this way throughout his theological engagement to express his theology and his emotional state. And a key psalm for him was the 46th Psalm. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. And he wrote his version, Ein feste Burg, in 1530 on his way to, when is Worms? I'm always getting mixed up. So, but in a time of deep trouble, when he was challenged to revoke his thesis, and so he, it's a song of confidence in God, of trusting in God, and if you want to open the hymn books just to get an overview of the content of the hymn, it's it's number 759. So he used for that a dance tune to set it to music. It's not quite clear whether it's just in the style of a contemporary dance tune or whether it's something he took over. But it is a kind of dance of defiance in which he casts this psalm. The first verse starts fairly literally. Our God stands like a fortress rock, ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, with walls that will not fail us. So God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not
though the earth be
moved. Yeah, thank you. Dennoch soll die Stadt Gottes lustig bleiben mit ihrem Brunnenleid. So I only know the Psalms in German in his translation. So the first, and it's built like a German proper hymn by the Meistersinger. So in a Aufgesang, a first half that introduces the theme, and the Aufgesang is normally fairly literally taken from the psalm, and then the Abgesang, the turning point, brings a theological interpretation. He introduces the devil, which isn't literally there. It's much more general enemies that the psalmist is describing. And the same kind of turning point occurs in the second verse, where we win no battles to our might, we fall at once dejected, the righteous one will lead our fight, by God himself directed. That's more or less the psalm. And then it is clearly not the psalm. You ask, who can this be? Christ Jesus, it is he. Eternal King and Lord, God's true and living word, no one can stand against him. So he injects his Christology into the Psalms, or he fills the general images of the psalmist with his theology and what defines for him the refuge and strength. And it takes on from there the even more personal note that really transports the psalm into the here and now. And this hymn, with others from the first hymn book, was translated by Miles Coverdale in his ghostly psalms and spiritual songs that were published at some point in the 1530s. He must have got them hot off the press. Some of them weren't even integrated into hymn books at that point in Germany, but were circulating just in broadsheets, which he could have picked up probably at the Hanseatic Contour in London, where merchants would bring this new exciting material. So he translates probably just 1 year or two after it was first written, this, but he is more cautious than Luther, so he takes it back to, he starts with a very literal translation of the first verse, which is close enough to the psalm, but then he omits Christ Jesus and instead talks about the God of Jacob is our strength, again, as it is in the psalm. But he adds biblical marginalia, where he then points. So he takes a different approach to that. And if you are interested in the Coverdale, we have, as a project with our students, digitized the only surviving copy of the Ghostly Psalms, which is in Queen's College. And because the book ended up on the index, so all copies, as far as we know, were burned except for this one copy and some fragments, which are 2 in the Bodleian and 2 in the Beinecke library of another copy, which also just might have been a proof copy. So it's by a great chance that it survived, but it meant in England it never took off in the same way in which it took off in Germany, where in 1535 there was a decree that every parish church, every parish school, Latin and German, had to have one of these hymn books. Let's see, the title page. These are Psalmen, geistliche Lieder und Chorgesang für Städt- und Dorfkirchen, lateinische und deutsche Schulen. You had a print run of several thousand copies for this hymn book, which is downsized for the facsimile. So you would have had it on a lectern. I put too much stuff on my own lectern, but it would have been something like that. So if you know the boys in a new college, they still kind of learn to sing from shared books. So the teacher would point along with a stick, and they would then learn to sing together with learning to read. So And I just said before, my mother went to a village school in Swabia in the late 1940s, and every morning the teacher would put up the big hymn book in front and they would learn one hymn from it. So it's a tradition that didn't stop. It was this communal aspect of singing and learning, reading through it. So I'll just sing from here. Yeah, I think I'm fine. Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, ein gute wir und Waffen. Hilft uns frei aus aller Not, die uns jetzt halt betroffen. Der Arbeit böse Feind mit Ernst erst jetzt meint, groß Macht und viel List, sein grausam Rüstung ist, auf Welt ist nichts seinesgleichen. So you can hear this dance of defiance, which was the version of the tune which was used until the Baroque period, when a different form of the aesthetics meant you didn't want to have this constantly jumping rhythm between 2 and 3, and you had to drag along a whole congregation that might be slow to get going. So the version that Bach said is the version that made it into the English hymn book, which is much like more evened out. Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott. And the reason why this was turned back, so I brought the organ books of my parents. Here you have again the Reformation rhythm, but this is a conscious going back to the Reformation period. And the reason for that is that this hymn and the other Reformation hymn have a long history then of being used as resistant songs, where you didn't want the calm thing, but this song of defiance. So when under Maria Theresia the Protestants were cast out of Austria, they had the choice either to emigrate or to stay behind and convert to Catholicism. But if they emigrated, they had to leave behind their children, and they chose to go out of the country rather than to become Catholic, singing the last verse here. Then let them take our lives, good children's husband, wives, and carry all away. This is a short-lived day, ours is the lasting kingdom. So, and that was carried through other resistance movements, while at the same time Luther in 19th century Germany became a national hero also of the conservative side. So the conservatives would sing, Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott, and the left wing would answer with Das Wort sie sollen lassen stehen, with the last verse of protest. So during the Kirchenkampf in the National Socialism, when there was a split of the church between the so-called Deutsche Christen, the fraction of the church that decided to accept Hitler's dominance of the church, and the Bekennende Christen, so the side of Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth, who decided this was ungodly, and there couldn't be no other Lord of the Church but Christ. They opened every meeting with this last verse of the hymn in the original rhythm. And so after the war, all the hymn books went back to the original rhythm, while before there had been both Bach and the Reformation rhythm included in the hymn books. I was just about to sing with you now once through the, but I'll postpone that until Jeffrey is back. All right. Yeah.
This is the second half.
Yeah.
Do you want me to play it? Are we singing it now?
Yeah. So I thought we should now sing it, yeah. And one note on the translation. Coverdale's translation obviously couldn't take hold because the copies were destroyed. Then it was one of the first German hymns to be translated into mainstream English by Thomas Carlyle, and his version was then the one that was used for ages in the hymn books. I'll just see my hymn books here. Sure. Sorry. Probably some of so that was translated in the mid-19th century. A safe stronghold, our God is still, and that might be the version with which some of you have grown up if you have encountered it. But that became a kind of bit of laughing stock because of this last verse. And well, they take our life, goods, honor, children, wife, yet is their profit small. This was used as a kind of fun catchphrase. After all this experience with German theology, it was considered not really appropriate to have such a deep resonating phrase as a kind of laughing stock image. The writers of the URC hymn book here, Rejoice and Sing, commissioned a new translation and by Stephen Orchard, which has now been taken over into ancient and modern. Because in the green one, there was no version of Ein feste book, and now reintroducing it, they didn't want to go back to Carlyle, but to this, which in a way reflects on the history of the hymn in the third verse, with the tyrants of this age strut briefly on the stage, which also has some comic effect, but at a place where it's appropriate, I'd say, to have the comic effect. All right, should we just sing it through?
How many verses? All three?
I think all 4 verses, yeah?
Okay, I'll just play over.
maybe if I can swap with you, then you have a the second hymn I want to look at, I'll deal with briefest, even though I could easily spend an evening just on the theology and history of it, and that is the Paul Gerhardt hymn Jesu, meine Freude, which is number 687 in your hymn books. But I needed as a linking text today mainly to show how the different elements I want to show, the community aspect, the communal singing, the emotional theology, and the resistance can be mixed and matched in different ways. So this foregrounds the emotional element. 6, 8, somehow I can't do numbers. Yeah. If we just look at briefly at the third verse, which is, I would argue, really a rephrasing of the second half of the first verse of Ein feste Burg. And Satan, I defy thee, world thou shalt not harm me, nor thy threats alarm me. And then God's great power guards every hour, earth and all its depths adore him, silent bow before him. But I would argue, so the key line is, while I sing of peace. Hier, ich stehe hier und singe in gar sicherer Ruhe. So, ich stehe hier und, ja, tobe Welt und springe, ich stehe hier und singe in gar sicherer Ruhe. Gottes Macht hält mich in Acht, kommt Abgrund muss verstummen, ob sie noch so brummen. And again, there was in the original version more of a rhythm than in the then equaled out a version in the English hymn book. So the same figure of thought of God as refuge against a hostile world, but the overcoming this world not in terms of triumphalism, success in worldly terms, but because the ultimate goal is Christ himself, and whate'er I here must bear, thou art still my purest pleasure, Jesu, priceless treasure. If any of you have the Bach in ears, you can really hear the Toben der Welt, the storms of the world assailing the singing person, but calmness enters through the singing of this. We'll sing the hymn later in the church, so I'll skip that because I'd be quite keen to test with you different versions of the third hymn we are looking at, and that is 605 by Gracious Pause. And this is something that wasn't written originally as a hymn, but by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who grew up in the German Protestant tradition of starting every morning with a Paul Gerhardt hymn. So you would start either with Martin Luther or with more often with Paul Gerhardt singing. He kept this practice while he was imprisoned. And so this poem, as I said, Luther would have written his first hymn with a chanting of the Psalms from the monastic background at the back of his mind. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote all his poems with the tunes of Protestant hymnody in mind. You can recognize the same rhetoric, but even more the mode of expressing resistance against the world and confidence in overcoming the world in the terms that Luther had shown with his rephrasing of the psalm, and which Paul Gerhardt then had given a pietist twist. And so this is outwardly not a song of resistance if you don't know the situation in which it is written, of waiting for the execution and knowing about the plot against Hitler having failed, and still saying with confidence it's the right way that we've gone in resisting Hitler. So it was one of the first new hymns to be set to music after World War II, and it became popular with a tune. Actually, I'll change the order I wanted to do it. If you could look at what is in the inside of the double spread, numbered 637. This takes the mode of confidence and comfort and rest. It's this here.
That one, yeah.
No, the other one. This one. Yeah.
Okay.
You're welcome to sing along. I'll just so it's arranged in a way that it takes the first verse as a refrain that is sung after each of the verses, and takes the others as narrative. Yeah.
Okay.
Von guten Mächten Wunder, Heil und Liebe, behütet und betröstet wunderbar. So will ich diese Tage mit euch lieben, und mit euch gehen in ein neues Jahr. Von guten Mächten wunderbare Namen, erwarten wir den Trost aus Augenwand. Und dies mit uns am Abend und ganz genießen jeden neuen Tag. Yeah, and in this form it became incredibly popular. It's probably the most sung hymn of post-war Germany, quite often sung with guitar accompaniment, and many people, including my father, just hated the tune as soppy and not really reflecting what I've tried to show. It's only calmness on the surface of it. It's a really deep meditation that takes in the dissatisfaction with the world as it is, wanting to change it, trusting in God, but not in this kind of nearly lullaby version. So I've printed on the back of the sheet the version that my father wrote now 25 years ago. He was delighted when I told him I would introduce Iffley to it. So let's try to sing this. Yeah, this exactly. Thanks for the thumbs up. The German Hymn Book Commission also thought they had to replace it. So on the left-hand side, you have the current version that is in hymn books such as the EG, the Evangelische Gesangbuch. They didn't know my father's version, so they came to a fairly similar, also minor version. Could you?
Yeah.
So we'll sing now on the left-hand side, just from
first line
yeah.
or two.
So this is a kind of trying actually to go back to modal tonality, trying to pick up the thread of the Reformation hymns by having this kind of in Reformation style writing of the hymn. The remaining two tunes are one that is in hymns ancient and modern.
Can you give me the music version?
It's Benji has it. So that is Finlandia, and then the other one I have also sung is Parry's Intercessor tune, which is in hymns ancient and modern, actually used for number 540, a different tune. Let's
Which one do you want to do first?
Let's do one verse to Finlandia and one verse then to Intercessor.
I'll just play the first bit over. Okay.
Thank you.
we'll do Intercessor.
Intercessor, here it
Yeah.
comes. Do you want me to play that over?
Is the tune in ancient and modern in number 540.
Shall I play the whole thing or the first line or two?
We'll sing a verse 2 to 4 to that, and people will get into it.
Okay.
You don't have to commit necessarily, but well, we can have a show of hands. Who would be for the very first, so the animals? Number second, my father's. Okay, well, please him very much. The Reformation style German hymn tune. Yeah? I probably would vote for that as well. I won't. Then Finlandia. Yeah. So, okay. I think it's completely inappropriate. And Intercessor. Yeah. Thank you. So I wanted to show how really these strands of Reformation, singing as a communal exercise, singing as a form of resistance, and especially as emotional theology, still hold true today. And it's much to do with what you associate with a tune, and in what state it takes you, and how you what you associate with a mode of tonality, with the stories you associate with the hymn, and what you have been brought up with. Whether it is like me in this stern Reformation style setting that you have spent your Sundays as a child, or whether it's the more 19th century English hymnal, because what we haven't really talked about, but which again would be a story for a whole evening, is how then the Church of England gradually through the 19th century adopted communal congregational singing. What we also haven't talked about the additional or alternative path of taken from psalm singing in the Reformation via the metrical psalms and the Geneva Psalter, which is also in Germany very much alive. So this Evangelisch Gesangbuch, which I have here, is that of a Reformed church in Germany, and you have the first third of the hymn book is just the Psalter, so you have one separate hymn for each of the psalms, and then you have the normal hymn book following, and the same was true for the Church of Scotland, that you would have all these metrical psalms, and so for a long time in the Anglophone world, this was pretty much the only congregational hymn singing that was there, and it's really via the Methodists in the early 19th century that hymn singing as a congregational exercise is introduced, and they come actually from the Pietist tradition in Germany. So Zinzendorf had a huge influence on John Wesley. They sailed together to the United States, and Wesley translated a lot of Zinzendorf hymns, which in turn are based on Paul Gerhardt. So that is this branch. So you have constantly weaving into the English tradition from different stages in the German development, and then with the Oxford movement you have a lot of new translation activities, but they tend to go back to pre-Reformation German or Dutch hymns. So a lot of the carols that then became very popular were collected by the Cowley Fathers and translated from Dutch and circulated. Well, they also came with Prince Albert as a translation of popular hymns. So I was very astonished to meet a lot of 19th century German hymnody in England, which in Germany had been chucked out after World War II because it was either too sweet or too militant. So Stille Nacht is banned from hymn books, German hymn books, as being much too soppy, and similar other children's hymns, or quite a lot of what Mendelssohn said, also the original of Hark the Herald Angels Sing, also all chucked out of the German hymn book. So you have some bits of German tradition that have only survived in England through translation, and others that have now been reintroduced through different ways. So you can write a whole culture history based on the history of the hymn book. Thank you. I believe we have coffee and tea, and you're welcome to explore my motley collection of hymn books.
Can I say thank you, Henrike? That was completely fascinating. I must say, this beautiful book here that we saw you singing and feste from is lovely. Nice of you to come and have a look. We could be having our tea break right now. I'm talking, Henrike asked if we could ask her more informally the questions that